listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Matthew Berkman. Our guest today is TARA SETMAYER. She's a CNN political commentator, contributor to ABC News, and former GOP communications director on Capitol Hill. She's also a senior advisor for the Lincoln Project and has been a prominent anti-Trump voice among Republicans for the last 4 years. TARA SETMAYER, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you're a woman of color, a conservative, and you were formerly a member of the Republican Party establishment. Can you tell us a little bit about your political biography? How did you come to conservatism? Was it something you were raised with, or did it develop separately? Did things change over time?
Sure. I've been a member of the Republican Party for about 27 years and made the decision the day after the election this year that I couldn't do it anymore. I was hopeful that Trumpism would be repudiated on the November 3rd election, but unfortunately it was not, despite the fact that Joe Biden won. Over 72 million people voted for 4 more years of Donald Trump. And then his behavior about undermining the election and the integrity of the election, which is just so fundamental to our democracy, that was being enabled by Republican leaders. And I just said, that's it. I cannot do this anymore. It is so anathema to everything that I thought the Republican Party stood for. And so I made the decision that I could no longer associate myself with a party that had succumbed to the malignancy of Trumpism. So, and what does that mean? Well, we look over what happened over the last 4 or 5 years with Donald Trump on the scene, and it didn't just start with him. It was clear that there was a slow march to this over the last decade or so, decade and a half. Some would argue since the 80s, but that's a different discussion. But more recently, with the Tea Party and kind of this idea of populism, nationalism, this white ethnocentric white grievance was becoming more central to the Republican Party identity than some of the more conservative tenets, more traditional tenets of the Republican Party that attracted me. The idea of individualism and empowerment and creating ladders of opportunity, which is something that Jack Kemp used to say, the former Housing and Urban Development Secretary under George H.W. Bush. He was very instrumental in influencing me in my conservatism growing up. And the idea of being present in the community where you could kind of live the conservative values that you preached, where you showed people in practice how those principles worked. He was a big believer in that and successful at it. And but that we're getting so far away from that, from smaller government, responsible fiscal responsibility, the idea of strong alliances. I'm not necessarily a neoconservative. Some would argue that, with George W. Bush and the Iraq War and Afghanistan and things like that. But I do believe in a strong national defense and maintaining our strategic alliances, particularly in Europe, with America at the center of the world order since, over 70 years since World War II. And the idea of NATO and international trade agreements, free trade. These were all things that were very traditional Republican principles. And all of that went out the window. Being pro-democracy, setting an example, as Reagan would say, as the shining city on the hill to other countries. They would always turn to America. What does the U.S. think? What would the U.S. do? And we can count on the United States to be that example. And that was going out the window with Donald Trump, with the ascension of Donald Trump and Trumpism. It was very disheartening. I was against him from the very beginning and very vocal about it. And I thought for sure that there would be other principled conservatives in the party that would say, no, this is not what we do. This is not who we are. This is not what the party of Lincoln represents. I mean, we were the party that fought for civil rights. We were the party that liberated the slaves and won the Civil War. That is so not what's happening now, and hasn't been happening for the last few years. So it has been, it's been a very, very disappointing experience over the last few years, watching the demise of a party that I loved and fought for and worked with and believed so strongly in, But my conservatism, what created the foundation for my political belief system, has not changed. It's just the party structure, which is fallible because the messengers are terrible right now, and maybe for a generation if Trumpism continues to dominate it. But I will continue to fight for conservative values outside of the traditional Republican Party establishment moving forward.
So have you become an independent, or are you now identified with the Democratic Party under Joe Biden? And if not, if you haven't switched to the Democratic Party, what is it about the current Democratic Party that doesn't appeal to you?
So I am not a Democrat, and I don't anticipate ever becoming one. I grew up my mom was a single parent. So I grew up in a single parent household. She had me at 21. And I grew up in the 80s and in the 90s. And there were a lot of things about the Democratic Party that I just didn't agree with. And a lot of it had to do with the overbearing, just just big government programs. Government's going to solve the problem. Let's just throw money at it. It didn't make sense to me. And my mom, she taught me to never be a victim, despite being a woman or a woman of color or coming from a single parent household, that never be a victim of your circumstance. And I felt like kind of the liberal progressive way of approaching things was a bit too government focused, too much identity politics. And that wasn't something that my mom or I thought was the way that we approach the world. I'm from North Jersey, right outside New York City, so we're kind of tough folks. And my grandfather was a police officer for 40 years in our hometown. My great-grandparents emigrated here from Germany and Italy. On my mother's side, on my father's side, they escaped the communist revolution in Guatemala in the 50s. So I just, the kind of the progressive worldview did not align with ours. So, and it still doesn't. I have no problem supporting Joe Biden for president against Donald Trump, for goodness sakes. My God, that wasn't even a hard choice. But I do not ascribe to some of the more left-wing progressive approaches to things, the AOCs and that wing of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders and just democratic socialism. That's not what I believe it should be the right approach to things, particularly from an economic perspective. I'm more of a pragmatic conservative, or a compassionate conservative is what George W. Bush called it. So there will be no Democratic Party affiliation for me, but I do not have a problem with finding bipartisan solutions to problems. We need to get back to governing. That seemed to have gone out the window under Donald Trump. It's been all tribalism and cult of personality and fighting one another constantly, and this obstructionism. And there's really been no governing and solving of problems. And I just think we need to have more of that. There needs to be a stronger center left, center right coalition here to get things done, because people are hurting, the country's in trouble, and we need to start solving some problems here and finding common ground. And I think there's a lot more of it once we start to listen again and not fight and worry about the president of the United States tweeting insults like a late night comic.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of got at this in something you said earlier. You mentioned, maybe it started, the shift of the Republican Party started under Reagan. I just want to know, how would you respond to someone that says, it's really been, it's been this way since, at least the 1970s. The Democrats have their own history of racism, but since, at least the 1970s, the Republican Party is the party that has been most associated with resisting the gains of social movements like the civil rights movement, women's movement, LGBT movement, and that, the racism of that Republican agenda might have been, before Trump, it might have been, couched in a colorblind language, or a language of equal opportunity, but really it was there all along. And white grievance is a core part of the Republican Party as we know it and have known it for decades. What do you say to that?
If you would have asked me that question 10 years ago, or even 6 or 7 years ago, I would have told you Well, that was on the fringe, and some of that had to do with just pure politics and numbers. The Southern strategy wasn't really about racism. It was about recognizing political opportunity and how to get the numbers in order to win elections. How do you get to 50+1? I have completely changed my perspective on that after watching what has happened with the rise of Donald Trump and him giving license to these people to emerge from the rocks under which they used to live and become more mainstream with the ethnic grievance and racism, the just flat out racism. And Trump using the law and order playbook of Nixon in 68, which was a direct byproduct of the riots of in 68, and the fear of people of color after Martin Luther King was assassinated in the riots in black cities, black neighborhoods and cities and things. And the idea of law and order, you don't want the black menace coming to your communities. And I mean, what Donald Trump was parroting was straight out of something from 1968. And I thought, you've got to be freaking kidding me. And people were eating this up. I'm like, it's 2020. What is happening? My good friend, Stuart Stevens, who is a veteran of 5 presidential campaigns, he's been a Republican consultant and ad maker for decades. He wrote a book called It Was All a Lie, which was like a big mea culpa for his role in engaging in some of these tactics that had racial undertones that he didn't really appreciate at the time. It was just really, again, more political. How do we win? How do we get a 50+1? And in retrospect, the Donald Trump era forced him to have to look back and go, oh my God, what role did I play in this? And his book was eye-opening for me. Stuart's a little older than I am, but like I said, I've been involved in Republican politics for 27 years, and I had to take a step back and say, maybe some of these things, maybe I played a role unwittingly, not knowing it, that this was really there all along. And I don't want to believe that it was everything, and it was, that was the underlying factor for a lot of the Republican policies. Progressives versus conservatives, we say it's not that we're against progress. We're in favor of prudent progress, not too fast. Let's be prudent about the changes because we're not against change. But some of those things, the idea of family values and character and morality, like those are important, but clearly it's not important if political power, if it's a choice between being principled or political power. We just saw the way that all of those things went out the window when it came to Donald Trump versus how Republicans approached the 90s with Bill Clinton. What Bill Clinton did and what got him impeached was, we can argue over the merits of that, but it was nothing compared to what the egregious behavior of Donald Trump and the blatant corruption and in-your-face violation of so many norms that Republicans screamed and freaked out about in the 90s and also under Barack Obama. And all of a sudden with Donald Trump, because he was giving them what they wanted in bits and pieces, whether it was the evangelicals, who were one of the most hypocritical groups, whether it was evangelicals with their, a couple of crumbs here on religious freedom, or if it was, the tax cuts for the fiscal folks, whatever, that was more worth it for them than the principles that they claim they believe forever. That level of hypocrisy is something that I just had to call out. I just couldn't stomach it. And I think that the Republican Party itself is going to have there has to be a reckoning. This is an unsustainable path for them because they've alienated so many groups. You can't claim that you're the big tent party and the party of Lincoln when you have the leader of the party is a blatant racist misogynist and xenophobe. That's just not sustainable given the demographics of the country and where we're heading. So, that's it's been all of it has been. I have to acknowledge that underbelly of racism and white grievance has been there all along. To what level, where, whether it was more prominent than I wanted to admit to or not, it makes it look like it was, unfortunately.
There's a lot to jump off of there. Well, here I'll go with this one. I mean, one interesting outcome of the election, at least insofar as we can trust exit polls, which in the pandemic maybe we can't, but we did see that Trump gained among Black voters and Latinx voters. How do you explain that?
So I am very, very leery of exit polls. They've been terrible for a long time. And given that you can't exit poll people who mail-in balloted, who did mail-in ballots, so that I think skews the exit polls a little bit. I will be curious to see how much those gains really were once we have a better sense of who voted and where. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that it is what they say now. I'd like to see the breakdown of demographics on that. I think that there are, for the Black community, I think it's a testament for Black men. And, it was supposed to be a little increase for Black women, but more for Black men. And it was the same thing in 2016. In 2016, I think Hillary Clinton, there's a certain amount of misogyny and a bit of mistrust with white women in the Black community, given the history of certain things. And also because of Hillary Clinton being a terrible candidate, she did not do a good job getting away from the super predator comments of the 90s and the idea that Bill Clinton's crime bill incarcerated, mass incarceration and all of that. She did a terrible job of explaining those things. So I think that had an impact. I also think the celebrity of Donald Trump in 2016 was something that was attractive to people, like rappers and culture. Donald Trump was kind of like the cool rich guy, and he was beamed into people's homes on The Apprentice. There was a certain persona that he'd created that people, like I said, I grew up in North Jersey, so I knew that it was a bunch of bullshit, Donald Trump, and what a terrible businessman he actually was. But a lot of people did not. So he was a great BS artist, a good con artist, and he duped a lot of people into believing this persona of being a successful billionaire businessman. That's how he was going to approach the presidency, and people bought into it, including some Black men who found maybe him being tough and cool something they would vote for Hillary Clinton. Here we are 4 years into it, and the country's a mess, but Donald Trump listened to Jared Kushner and gave away some goodies, right? So he could constantly repeat the lowest Black unemployment, criminal justice reform. You have jobs, I'm helping you get free, funding historically Black colleges, restoring their funding. Now, of course, there's nuances to all of these things, but anyone who knows anything about propaganda or marketing knows that social repetition creates reality. So if people keep hearing this over and over and over again, they can be dismissive of, well, that's just him putting on an act, or, yeah, he might be a racist, but hey, we've got jobs. It's the greatest unemployment, and, criminal justice reform, they're going to, change things. So my buddies are not going to be in prison anymore. That's great. That starts to sink into the psyche. So people, cognitive dissonance happens in all areas and all things all the time, but this will be a case study in the power of propaganda. And I think that that's part of what attracted Black men to Donald Trump, despite his blatant racism. It's a fascinating dynamic. Economics can be a very powerful tool. Now, as far as Latinx, that was economic also. It's a very wide community, just like the Black community isn't a monolith. The Hispanic community isn't either. So when you look at what happened in South Florida with Cubans and people that came out of those socialist oppressive type of governments, and they looked at hearing, well, again, propaganda, the Trump campaign continually pumped in these messages of socialism, 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 and comparing Joe Biden to, which is absurd, comparing Joe Biden to, we don't want to turn into Venezuela or Cuba and Castro. And that resonated with those folks because they came out of those oppressive regimes and were like, we're not going back to that. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Again, power of propaganda. So that's what happened in South Florida. And I think that the Biden campaign, the Democrats mistakenly took for granted the power of those messages, and they didn't really campaign in Florida to do anything to combat that. So they kind of gave away Florida and used their resources and put them in other places, which was unfortunate. As far as in Texas, in some of the border counties there, that was all about energy, oil and gas, again, economics. And you have a lot of the pro-law enforcement message, the whole law and order message. The Latinos there responded to that because you have a lot of border patrol and law enforcement in those counties. And also, a lot of people are in the oil and gas industry. So they don't want to hear, they don't care about, well, Donald Trump is, build the wall in Mexico. That went away, if you realize. We didn't hear much of that in the final year of this campaign. But what you did hear was, Joe Biden's going to get rid of fracking. The Green New Deal is going to, destroy our energy industry. And so when you have a lot of folks, especially in Texas and some of those counties that are employed primarily by those industries, that's just self-interest. So I think that's something that the Democrats need to reconsider. And also when you have a large Catholic, contingent, the pro-life issue is still something that has an impact, even though we all know that that's really not a federal issue directly. It's more states that control those laws. It doesn't matter. The perception is pro-life, and these folks are godless, religionless, heathens, and that resonates again for family-oriented Hispanic communities that don't want to see that. So it's complicated. It's something that I think we'll be studying for a little while as to why, given the complete, opposite way that Donald Trump conducted himself, how people would still choose him. But again, cognitive dissonance can be a powerful thing.
Given that Trumpism clearly resonates with so many GOP voters right now, what strategies would you propose for kind of more conventional Republican candidates that are trying to make headway in the party, succeed in primaries, presidential primaries, where they, were trounced by Donald Trump in 2016? What could they do better?
So I think that I think a lot of the American public, most of the American public that's not part of the cult of personality of Trump, they're just exhausted by the chaos. And I think that's why you saw Democrats lose seats and Republicans gain seats and maintain the Senate, but yet Donald Trump was repudiated, right? They don't want that guy. But they also don't want the AOC type of Democrat party either. So we're going to balance it out. There was a lot of ticket splitting. And like I said earlier, I think that the country is still a right of center, left of center party. It's not fully progressive, not fully conservative. And I think that the more traditional Republican candidates need to figure out a way to reject the lunacy of the extremist part of the party that runs the primaries, which is a challenge. I'm not quite sure how they do that because they've been emboldened by winning seats, and you have QAnon conspiracy theory people now in Congress, which is insane. You have these flat out, racists like the youngest member in North Carolina. These are people who have no business being in office, but they won their primaries, and party affiliation, party identity is still very strong. It's tough for people to walk away from their party. Negative partisanship is still a huge motivator. So I'm not sure. It takes courage to stand up and say, this is not who we are. This is not what our communities stand for. This is what I believe in and why, like a more positive message to combat the negativity of it. But what makes it more difficult now than in the past is that you have a right-wing media echo chamber that is really powerful, that is reinforcing a lot of this dysfunction. Something that we didn't have before. Before you had, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and talk radio. Now you have all of those plus the internet, plus all of these, all of these avenues for misinformation to come in, to be spread. You have social media. We didn't have that before. And that is, that's an exponential threat here with information and misinformation that is being beamed into people's homes constantly and on their phones, and where they can silo themselves off and just get, reinforced with certain information. It's a challenge. So I don't really have the answer. I'm not quite sure. I haven't figured that out yet. I just know what we don't want, how we fix it yet. I still think we're figuring it out. Because people, when they're elected officials, the only way they change is when they lose, right? They're single seekers of re-election, which is why I was quietly hoping that there would be a repudiation of Trumpism and a repudiation of the Republican Party in its current form. But there wasn't. So there's no incentive to change. One incentive is there to change until they start losing. Then they'll change.
Do you think Trump will be the 2024 Republican candidate?
Oh, God, I hope not. I don't know. He doesn't really like the job, right? It's clear he likes the idea of being president. He likes the perks. He doesn't like to actually do the job. So I think that, again, this idea of him running running in 2024 again is just part of the grift. It's just a part of the way to keep it going, to keep his crazy supporters constantly excited and ginned up, and he can keep bilking them for money and stringing them along. He doesn't really want to run again. First of all, he's going to be a lot older. He's not a healthy guy. And it takes a lot of work to actually be president, and he knows that. So he can just keep it, floated out there and keep stringing them along. And it also puts up a roadblock for other Republicans who want to run. So that's, Donald Trump doesn't give a damn about the Republican Party or the future of it. He only cares about himself. So, will the Republican Party say, okay, look, you need to make a choice here because we have other people in line. I don't know. I'm not holding my breath. They haven't, stood up to him yet. So, but now they're looking at their electoral prospects and saying, is this a good idea or not? Not quite sure. I mean, when you have the Trump kids looking at, running the RNC now, or, putting them up in charge of the party, that's a scary thought. I mean, I just think that that's the beginning of the end. Like I said, it's unsustainable, maybe for another cycle or two, but the demographics in this country is not going to allow that. But like I said, Donald Trump and his family, they don't care. They don't care about the future of the party. They don't care if they destroy, one of the great parties. They don't care. So if he's, God help us if he's the nominee in 2024 again, good grief. We're exhausted already. Please go away.
I know you said that you don't like identity politics, but I wanted to know if you think that your particular combination of identities as a woman and a person of color, and especially a conservative, that combination gives you a kind of a unique perspective on American politics. If so, what is that perspective? And specifically, what can it teach people like to the left of you, people on the progressive end of the spectrum?
So yes, I mean, I wear my otherness as a badge of valor. No, I don't fit in anybody's box. And that's been great because I'm a nonconformist, always have been. My mom has always taught me to embrace being different. And, because if you're just a regular person, that's boring. And who wants that? Keep it exciting. And it just gives me a more well-rounded view of things. Culturally, I have, varying perspectives on things. It's not just one, which is great. And I think that it also teaches people not to be presumptuous. Sometimes someone will look at me and they'll think, oh, well, she's a woman of color, so she must be a Democrat or a progressive. And it's like, no. And I think that's important too, because it knocks down stereotypes. Don't be presumptive, especially now. There's things people are with millennials and Gen Zers, like there's a very different, more open-minded approach to kind of hybrid approach to politics now, where you have some people who are very fiscally conservative, but more socially liberal, and they don't really even identify with one party or the other. I think the middle is growing actually with the younger generations, and which is a good thing. I think it challenges ideas. It challenges people to think outside the box. So I think that's an advantage that I've had and that's the approach I've always had with politics anyway. The goal was never just to be like, I'm right, or to win arguments. It's always been to problem solve, to make people's lives better. This is still the greatest country in the world, despite our flaws. And now that Donald Trump won't be in office for 4 more years, it won't just completely destroy our constitutional republic. So there's still hope there. But the idea of talking through those ideas and critically thinking and problem solving, I think the more diversity you have in approach to those things, the better. The better. We need to stop looking at each other as enemies and everything is a battle, a win or a loss. And I got into politics because I wanted to solve problems and help make people's lives better. And I just felt that the conservative viewpoint, worldview, was the most effective way. But that doesn't mean that some progressive ideas or my progressive friends are my enemies. No, they're not. We just have a difference of opinion. Mm. But I think ultimately our goals are the same.
Have you considered running for office yourself?
Yes, it's something I've always wanted to do. And, the climate we're in complicates it a bit, but it's still a goal I have. It's always been my heart. So we'll see what happens.
Well, TARA SETMAYER, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.